Lesson I'd like to present on a term called the Kezazah. K-E-Z-A-Z-A-H. Might be a familiar term some people have heard before. It's Hebrew for a cutting off. That's what it means. A lot of times it's used as, nowadays if you come across the term, you're probably going to find charismatic as in the way that they do it, not necessarily a category to place them in, but a charismatic speaker in front of an assembly, giving a lesson on the prodigal son, and giving a little bit of insight into this Kezazah. It's fascinating, it's intriguing, and when you first hear it, you feel like you got this little extra layer that got it added to it, that adds some depth and understanding, touches your heart, and you're like, oh wow, that's great, I really want to hold on to it. And that's how I felt anyway the first time I heard it. And a few weeks back, I'm here, and as a lot of you will probably recognize, I have something exciting. I want to share it with people around me. And it's like, hey, check out this neat thing that I came across or I read. I want to share the information. And I've done that with that. And we get done talking, and he's fascinated. He says, man, you ought to really do a lesson on that one. I'd love to hear it. And he said, if you don't, I probably will. He said, okay, well, I'll go ahead and I'll dig into it. I think at the time, like, the information was maybe 2 days old in my head. Maybe I should have been a little bit more prudent, than what I allowed to come out of my mouth in that moment, but it was exciting, and I was sharing some information. I live in the perhaps. I try not to go beyond what is written, although I enjoy discovering different cultural contexts or ideas that can help shape my understanding of first century Jews or people previous to that. So that's where we're going to start. Now, Kezazah, so what is it? The way that it would put out it was made, we'll talk about how the gentleman came to putting forth the idea and how it came to be in widespread circulation. And then here lately, if you haven't seen it lately, spend a little bit of time looking up your normal biblical content on whether it's Instagram, Snapchat, some kind of real Facebook, YouTube short. You're going to come across the video of it eventually, especially now that I've talked about it out loud in the hearing of all of y'all cellular devices. I'm sure it will pop up. The story goes like this. Let's start off with reading. Let's go to Luke 15, verse 11. We'll start off reading in the prodigal son. And for the sake of easy reading, I am going to be reading out of the ESV. So Luke 15, starting in verse 11. And he said, there was a man who had 2 sons, and the younger of them said to his father, Father, give me the share of property that is coming to me. And he divided his property between them. Not many days later, the younger son gathered all he had, and he took a journey into a far country. And there he squandered his property in reckless living. And when he had spent everything, a severe famine arose in that country. He began to be in need. So he went and he hired himself out to one of the citizens of that country, who sent him into his fields to feed pigs. And he was longing to be fed with the pods that the pigs ate. No one gave him anything. But when he came to himself, he said, how many of my father's hired servants have more than enough bread? But I perish here with hunger. I will arise and go to my father, and I will say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Treat me as one of your hired servants. And he arose and he came to his father. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and felt compassion, and ran and embraced him and kissed him. And we need to stop right there in the story, because this is where they will introduce the Kezazah. And they'll tell you about a Jewish tradition that all the townspeople would have been aware of this wayward son who had left his community, who had taken his inheritance from his father and gone to squander it in wild, loose living. There would have been a controversy in the villages, the backdrop, and that this would have been known to the peoples, communities being the way that they were right then. And then, same as the father would have seen him off in the distance, the rest of the village would have been waiting as well. while they were waiting, they would have seen him coming, and they would have gotten some clay pots. And in these clay pots, they would have taken some cobs from corn, like all dried out. They would take some burnt grain, so once again, something that can't produce any kind of growth. And they would have taken some nuts, and they would put it all here in this clay pot, devoid of life, and they would have ran out as fast as they could to this guy as he's coming back to the village. They would have stood before him, and everybody would have taken that clay pot, and they would have smashed it on the ground in front of him, and they said, "Let your life be like this shattered pot, full of death, decay, nothing that promotes growth. Your life is going to be shattered. Let it be like that. Your relationships end." They're pronouncing a curse on it. And they'll say in this story that that's called the Kezazah, the cutting off. They're cutting off from the community, and so the father, in seeing this, that's why he's looking. He's got to run out there, he's got to beat the villagers to it before they can perform this ceremony. And before that son can even apologize, the father embraces him and he kisses him. And they'll generally end the story right there without even finishing the part of the prodigal son. And they'll say, that's because grace always outruns condemnation. My truth. And walk away. Cool story, bro. True. That's what I was curious about. Is it true? Short answer, perhaps. I think, like I said, we need to live in that area on anything that's outside the Bible. We got to live with that word, perhaps. As Bob's pointed out in his lesson on Philemon, when it came to Onesimus and Paul is talking, he doesn't say, absolutely force it, this happened in order to glorify and add him to the record. Perhaps. Because he can't speak on that authoritatively. He can't speak on this authoritatively. And I think this will be some of the background for it. So where's the idea come from? Kenneth Bailey. Lots of Baileys that have written about the Bible and different sort of stuff. But Kenneth Bailey, back in 1976, he wrote a tract called Poet and a Peasant. He ended up expounding upon this work, and he wrote a book called The Cross and the Prodigal. He was a Middle Eastern New Testament scholar, very well respected. His findings were based upon the Mishnah, which was compiled in around 200 AD, and some writings in the Babylonian Talmud, which are attributed to around 400 to 500 AD. The thing that we need to take away from this is Jesus was walking around 33 AD. That's when his contemporaries and people involved in these parables and stories and the audience would have been living. So this is where he extrapolates for that from. There's 2 entries in those documents that describe this ceremony. One of them being applied to a son that received his inheritance of land and then went and sold it to the Gentiles. This would be how we would cut them off. And the other example, and then even Bailey argues against this, saying that that can't be the case in this one because the son didn't sell land to get the money to squander among the Gentiles. That's and I think he was arguing against Rockenstein, like a German scholar that was arguing that. And then the other one was if a Gentile or a Israelite took a Gentile wife, they would cut them off. And that's the ceremony that was outlined in both of these. And in his original writing, like when he was arguing back and forth with Rockenstein, even Bailey used language that was more like perhaps, could have been, in reference to this ceremony. Later on, when he wrote it into his book, and then everybody subsequently picked it up and ran with it and incorporated it into lessons with a degree of certainty that wasn't present in his original postulation. Well, then when he was quoting about it, he said it in very certain terms, quote, "At the time of Jesus, the Jews had a method of punishing any Jewish boy who lost his family inheritance to Gentiles." And then he would go on to describe the Kezazah. No perhaps listed there. All that ends up being, with the evidence that we have, as it's described, speculative at best. We don't know. That being said, like all Middle Eastern culture is heavily based in honor and shame. The idea that that son would think that he was going to come back and receive some kind of public shaming is evident by the very fact that he said he was hoping to come back and be high as one of his father's hired servants. He's not looking to be able to have his position, his authority, his standing, any of that. He's going to be a lower version. He's expecting some kind of public shaming to come from that. This ceremony is never mentioned. I think that Bailey has the right idea. He's quoted as saying that he wanted to be able to read the Gospels through the lens of a Near Middle Eastern culture. That's how he wanted to view the New Testament. So through the audience that's directly surrounding the events that are taking place, I think that's a wise way to do it. There's a guy, Michael Heiser, who said the same thing with regard to the way that he read the Old Testament, is that he wanted to read it as an ancient Israelite would. He wanted to have an ancient Israelite in his mind as he read these passages to understand what was being spoken about. I think, as Jake was talking about this morning, context is key to understanding a lot of the scriptures. So, where the evidence lands us. We got the claim that there's an ancient Jewish, in the ancient Jewish they could exclude or shame people. Okay, very high. Everybody, we got a lot of confidence that that happened. So some form of the Kezazah existed in tradition. Yeah, that's really high up there too. We can have a lot of confidence in that. Maybe later rabbinic tradition preserved an older practice. They recorded it up here at 200, 300, 400 AD. But it was something that took place during the first century. Yeah, that's plausible. I could believe that. That there was a pottery smashing ceremony and it existed in ancient Galilee. That's uncertain. It's poorly demonstrated. You can't say that with any kind of certainty. Last one. Jesus was specifically using this ceremony as a backdrop for Luke 15. It's possible. It ain't proven. That's that perhaps area again. So should we use it as a backdrop for understanding of Luke 15? I don't think it's necessary. We don't need it to further stoke our fires when it comes to this parable. There's enough meat in the story to show God's grace without having to draw this parallel of, a running foot race. Then conclusion. Please go with me to 2 Corinthians 2. 2 Corinthians 4, verse 2. Paul speaking. He says, "But we have renounced disgraceful, underhanded ways. We refuse to practice cunning or to tamper with God's word, but by the open statement of the truth, we will commend ourselves to everyone's conscience in the sight of God." We know that we need to deal truthfully with the scriptures, that we need to deal carefully with the scriptures. And just because something tickles the ears, something adds a layer, something is exciting to it, we can't add that in there with any kind of degree of certainty. Otherwise, I don't believe that we're dealing as carefully with the scripture as we should. And we start pouring into trying to use rhetoric to convince rather than the scripture itself. So now let's go back to Luke 15. Continue reading on the prodigal and see why we don't need the Kezazah as the backdrop for it. Luke 15, starting in verse 17. "But when he came to himself, he said, 'How many of my father's hired servants have more than enough bread, but I perish here with hunger? I will rise and go to my father, and I will say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Treat me as one of your hired servants.' And he arose and he came to his father. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and felt compassion, ran and embraced him and kissed him. And the son said to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. But the father said to his servants, Bring quickly the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his hand and shoes on his feet. And Bring the fat calf and kill it, and let us eat and celebrate. This is my son, for this my son was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. And they began to celebrate. Let's stop there. So let's look at what the prodigal did first. He demands his inheritance from his father while he's still alive. I don't know, you can get more insulting than that, you know. You're pretty much saying, I wish you were dead. What you have that's worth anything to you, give it to me now. He leaves his household, his community, goes to a distant country, people that don't even worship his God. He's rejecting all of his upbringing in this. He squanders the family property. He associates with Gentiles. He becomes destitute. And then it says he finally comes to his right mind and he's going to return with an apology. What's the father do? Number one, he sees him from far off. He's looking for him. One of the things that I see in this, like as I look at my own life and examples, I'm trying to understand the principles that are being imparted to me, is he hadn't hardened his heart against him. It's evidence in the next verse, but he's looking for him afar off. He sees him. He runs to him. Let's go back to that shame thing in their culture. It's not a big deal if I see Russell running down the street nowadays. Let's go back to first century Jerusalem, and I see Russell reach down and pick up his robes all undignified like and hold him up before him and then take off running, where now I can see his knees, his calves, and his ankles. That's shameful. Men of dignity don't run. They don't rush. They don't expose their legs. So this is shameful behavior for them. This would have been embarrassing. It would have been contrary to the sort of thing people talk about. Obviously, the father don't give two bits about that. He's going to run to his son. It says he felt compassion for him. He embraces him. He doesn't even let his son get the apology out of his mouth before he's greeting him with love. He forgives him by those actions. And then he calls for the best robe to be given to him, which is probably going to be his robe. He doesn't say, hey, bring my robe for the boy. No, he says, bring the best robe. Well, I mean, you know how Middle Eastern culture is. The best robe is going to be his robe. Everybody's going to know it's his robe too. That's what's being placed on the son. He's being shielded in this. We're going to bring his shoes. This is position and authority. The things that were given up when he chose to leave his father's household. They're being restored. And they tell him to bring the fattened calf. The celebration, when they call it that fattened calf, they're going to have everybody there. So now the same community that's going to be rejecting him, that's going to be wanting to be angry and ostracize him because of the shame that he's brought on his family, they're going to, I don't know about y'all, I get more offended for other people than I do for myself. You can go ahead, you can say something to me, you can use the wrong tone with me, you know, and I might bristle a little bit. I can tamp that stuff down a little bit. You say something rude to my wife, I instantly get offended. I think there's an aspect of like those that we love, we get offended for. And in a community like this, I imagine there's love, there's a lot of extended family. I think there's probably a lot of people that were angry at this son on the behalf of that father. All that's nipped in the bud. The father restores him. He shows that he has his favor. His position and his authority have been restored to him. And not only that, we're going to celebrate him being back here. He restores him to the community. He restores him to position. He restores him within the family. So all that meat there, it's expertly seasoned. It doesn't need some kind of A1 type additive thrown on top of it to improve the flavor. It's pretty good just the way it is. Let's go back to the last point. And this one my last point, this one I haven't heard much anywhere. This is the third parable in a series of parables. Luke 15 starts off with an accusation being hurled at Jesus by the Pharisees and the scribes. That he sits and meets with tax collectors and sinners. And who's saying this? The Pharisees and the scribes. They're the ones who would have been the eldest son in this story, if you will. So let's go ahead and pick up now in verse 25. Now his older son was in the field, and as he came and drew near to the house, he heard music and dancing. And he called one of the servants and asked what these things meant. And he said to him, your brother has come, and your father has killed the fattened calf because he has received him back safe and sound. But he was angry, and he refused to go in. And his father came out and entreated him. But he answered his father, look, these many years I've served you. I've never disobeyed your command, yet you never gave me a young goat that I might celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours came, not my brother, when this son of yours came, who has devoured your property with prostitutes, you killed the fattened calf for him. And he said to him, son, you are always with me, and all that is mine is yours. It was fitting to celebrate and be glad. For this your brother, not my son, was dead, and is alive. He was lost, and is found. That elder son, when Jesus was talking to the Pharisees, in his example there, that elder son was angry that the father forgave and restored his brother, those sinners and tax collectors. I think that's one of the most important points of that story. It's a story of restoration. I think that that's something that we've all come across the need for in our lives. Otherwise, we wouldn't call ourselves Christians. We would have committed ourselves to the Lord as we have. So is there anybody here that's in need of restoration? Because we got a blueprint on how to start that process if you hadn't already. You hear, believe, repent, confess, be baptized, and live faithfully. Maybe your heart, your thinking aren't what they should be about something like the prayers of the church. Whether it be for this or some other reason, I ask you to come forward while we stand and sing. Come to Jesus.